November 7th, 1944, 2:47 a.m. A black soldier is lying face down in the mud inside a United States Army camp in France. He is not bleeding from a German bullet. He is bleeding from an American baton. The man standing over him is not a Nazi. He is wearing the same eagle on his helmet as every Allied soldier in the European theater. He is an American military policeman, and he is not stopping. This is not happening in secret. 3 other MPs are watching. 2 white officers walk past without slowing their stride. The soldier on the ground stops moving. The baton keeps swinging. 40 documented cases. That is how many times black American soldiers had been beaten by white MPs across the European and Mediterranean theaters by the autumn of 1944. 40 cases, with names, dates, unit numbers, filed by the NAACP directly to the Secretary of War. And the number of prosecutions those 40 cases produced, 0. Not 1. The system had looked at the evidence 40 times and decided 40 times that nothing had happened worth punishing. But this time, word of what happened traveled up the chain of command, all the way to a general whose name the Germans said with something between fear and professional respect. All the way to George S. Patton, commander of the Third Army, the most aggressive armored force on the Western Front. And what Patton did next is the part of this story that nobody tells. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This is a community built for people who believe history is not just what happened, it is the story of who we choose to become. Before we get to Patton's decision, you need to understand the world that produced the soldier bleeding in that mud. Because nothing about what happened that night makes sense unless you understand the machine that was running inside the machine. The war inside the war. The United States Army of 1944 was the most powerful military force the Western world had ever assembled. 2.5 million men in the European theater alone. Thousands of tanks. An air force that could darken the sky over an entire country. Logistical pipelines stretching from American factories across 3,000 miles of ocean to the front lines of France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. It was by every material measure a marvel of industrial civilization, and it was completely, deliberately, institutionally segregated, not informally, not by accident, by policy, by design, by the deliberate decision of the United States War Department, which had determined, citing studies it commissioned from researchers, it selected to reach conclusions it had already decided that black soldiers could not be trusted to perform at the level required for modern combat. Could not lead. Could not think fast enough under fire. Could not be trusted with the psychological weight of killing. These were not fringe opinions held by a few racist officers in the Deep South. These were the official findings of the United States Army. They were encoded in training manuals, promotion policies, and assignment procedures that ensured black soldiers spent the war doing the jobs white soldiers did not want: cooking, loading ships, driving trucks, building roads, hauling ammunition to the front lines, and then being ordered to the rear before the shooting started. The military police were the enforcement arm of this arrangement. In the rear echelon areas where black service units were concentrated, the MPs operated not as neutral law enforcement, but as the physical expression of the Army's racial hierarchy. They had broad authority. They had batons. They had the backing of a system that had never once in the entire history of the war punished a white MP for violence against a black soldier. 40 cases. 0 prosecutions. The men who built this system believed it made the Army stronger. They were wrong in a way so catastrophic, so measurable, so thoroughly documented by subsequent history that it belongs in the category of strategic blunders alongside the Maginot Line and Germany's decision to invade the Soviet Union. But in November 1944, no one with the authority to change the system had yet chosen to confront it directly. No one except, as it turned out, the general everyone expected least. George Smith Patton, Jr. was born on November 11, 1885 in San Gabriel, California, into a family that had been producing soldiers since before the American Revolution. His great-great-grandfather had fought under George Washington. His grandfather had died leading a Confederate charge at the Battle of Cedar Creek. War was not a career for the Pattons. It was a vocation, a theology. Patton grew up reading military history the way other children read adventure novels. Caesar, Napoleon, Frederick the Great. By the time he arrived at West Point in 1904, he had already decided what he was for. Combat, command, the application of organized violence towards strategic objectives. Everything else was prelude. He was dyslexic, a fact he never acknowledged publicly, and fought every day of his academic career to conceal. He graduated 46th out of 103 in his West Point class. Not a brilliant student, a determined one. A man who understood earlier than most that the gap between what you could do and what you were willing to endure was the only thing that actually mattered. He competed in the modern pentathlon at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, finishing 5th overall first among all competitors in the shooting and equestrian events. He studied fencing in France, became the Army's master of the sword, redesigned the standard cavalry saber. In World War I, he commanded the 1st American tank unit in combat, was shot through the leg at the Battle of the Argonne while standing in the open directing his tanks forward, and was carried off the field only after he had refused evacuation long enough to be personally cited for valor by General John Pershing. This is the man who was now commanding 250,000 soldiers in France in the autumn of 1944. But here is the thing about Patton that his biography usually skips over. The thing that explains what happened after the soldier was beaten in his camp. Patton had a theory about armies that was more sophisticated than his public image suggested. He believed with a specificity that most of his peers lacked that an army's fighting power was a function not just of its equipment and numbers, but of its psychological coherence, its morale, its internal sense of justice. He had seen in World War I and in the North African and Sicilian campaigns what happened to units where the men did not trust their officers, where the system that was supposed to protect them had demonstrated through action or inaction that it did not consider their lives worth protecting. Those units fought poorly. They made mistakes at decisive moments. They surrendered when they should have held, when they should have withdrawn, because the instincts that good morale produces had been replaced by the paralysis that injustice creates. This was not a moral framework. It was an operational one. Patton cared about his men's well-being for the same reason he cared about his tank's mechanical condition. Because a broken tank does not take objectives, and a soldier who does not trust the army he is fighting for does not fight at full strength. Now, here is where the story pivots. October 13th, 1944. 1 month before the beating. The 761st Tank Battalion had just arrived in France, and General Patton was preparing to address them before their first combat deployment. The 761st was at that moment a unit that existed in a kind of institutional limbo. They had trained for 2 years. 2 years, while the war moved without them. While other units, white units, went to North Africa, to Sicily, to Normandy, they sat in training camps being evaluated, re-evaluated, and evaluated again, every assessment designed not to determine whether they were ready, but to find a reason to conclude that they were not. They were ready. They had been ready for a year. Their commander, Colonel Paul Bates, had said so repeatedly to anyone who would listen. The Army had not listened, but Patton listened to something else. He looked at the data. He looked at their training scores, their technical proficiency ratings, their maintenance records. He looked at the men themselves. And then, he said something to them that no senior American general had said to a black unit in the entire war. He told them he did not care what color they were. He told them he had never seen men who wanted to fight more, and that given the chance, they were going to make him proud. He told them that in the Third Army, he expected them to perform like soldiers. And in the Third Army, he intended to treat them like soldiers. This was not a speech for posterity. There were no journalists present, no photographers. Patton said these things because he meant them in the operational sense. He needed fighters. He had fighters in front of him. The paperwork classifying them as second-class soldiers was, from his perspective, an administrative fiction that the operational reality was about to dissolve. He was right. But first, he had to deal with November 7th. The report reached him through channels that moved faster than official communication always did in Patton's headquarters, because Patton had built an intelligence network within his own staff that was in its way as sophisticated as the signals intelligence operation running against the Germans. He wanted to know everything that happened inside his perimeter. His aides competed to bring him information before he found it himself, because discovering it himself was worse. What arrived on his desk in the pre-dawn hours of November 8th was not a formal report. It was a verbal account from an aide who had spoken to an officer who had witnessed the aftermath. The details were incomplete, but the core facts were not. A black soldier had been beaten by white MPs inside Third Army's camp. The soldier was in the medical tent. The MPs were not in custody. The controlled fury that Patton's staff had learned to recognize, the one they distinguished from his theatrical rages, because the theatrical rages were performance, and this was not settled over him the way weather settles. He summoned the senior MP officer involved. The accounts of what happened in that room vary. Officers in the corridor outside reported sustained quiet voices, which was more alarming than shouting. Patton's theatrical fury was a known quantity. His quiet fury was the one that ended careers. What Patton communicated in that room was a principle he had already demonstrated twice before in his command. Once when he had stripped a white captain of his command for refusing to return a salute from a black lieutenant. Once when he had personally intervened in a disciplinary proceeding where a black soldier was being charged under rules that did not apply to the white soldiers standing next to him. The principle was simple. Military law in the Third Army was not a cafeteria where you selected which soldiers it protected. It applied to every soldier equally, or it applied to none. A selective law was not law, it was a weapon. And Patton did not permit his army's legal machinery to be used as a weapon against his own troops. The MPs were disciplined. The specifics varied by account. Reduction in rank, formal censure, reassignment. But the discipline was real, and Patton made certain it was visible. He understood with the strategic instinct that made him genuinely dangerous as a commander that a punishment nobody knew about was not a deterrent. It was a secret. And secrets in an army that ran on rumor and unit identity protected nobody. The punishment needed to travel through the same informal networks that had carried the news of the beating. It did. Sergeant Samuel Ransom of the 761st, one of the battalion's most decorated NCOs. A man who had already survived the brutal armored engagements at Geilenkirchen and other forward positions in the weeks following their deployment, later described in post-war interviews what it felt like when word reached the battalion. He said the men did not celebrate. They went quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when something you did not dare to expect actually occurs. The general had acted. The system for once had not looked away. But Patton was not finished, because he understood that a single punishment, however visible, was not a structural change. It was a signal, and signals needed to be reinforced with architecture. He issued a standing instruction to his staff. Not a formal written order, because Patton distrusted paper when direct communication was available. A standing instruction that any complaint from any black soldier in the Third Army about mistreatment by white personnel was to be brought to his personal attention within 24 hours. Not to the Inspector General, not to the Judge Advocate General's office, to him, personally. Every officer on his staff understood what this meant. Patton was placing himself between his black soldiers and the institutional machinery that had been grinding them down since the war began. He was making himself the circuit breaker in a system designed to let current flow only one way. MPs in Third Army's area began with measurable, if imperfect, consistency to police black soldiers the way they were legally required to, as soldiers. Not as a population requiring suppression. In the context of 40 documented beatings and 0 prosecutions, this was a statistical break so sharp it bordered on the impossible. It did not fix the army. It did not dissolve the institutional racism that had built the segregated system. But it changed the temperature inside Third Army's perimeter in a way that every black soldier serving there could feel. And it was about to matter more than anyone knew. Because 700 miles to the east in a forest called the Ardennes, 30 German divisions were staging in secret. Field Marshal Walter Model had a plan. A desperate, audacious, potentially war-ending plan. And when it detonated on December 16, 1944, it would tear a hole in Allied lines 85 miles wide, threaten to split the American and British armies in two, and produce the single most chaotic 2 weeks of the entire Western Front campaign. Patton would have 72 hours to wheel 250,000 men 90 degrees north through frozen roads and drive them toward a town called Bastogne. He would need every unit he had, including the 761st. And what those men were about to do in the snow and ice of Belgium with German Panthers on their left flank and a collapsing Allied line on their right against an enemy that had decided this was the battle where everything would be decided, that is a story that the United States Army would spend 52 years trying not to officially acknowledge. In Part 2, we go to the Ardennes. We go to Tillet. We go to the moment when the 761st Tank Battalion met the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division in terrain that military historians still argue about in weather that grounded every Allied aircraft over the battlefield, in conditions where the difference between a Sherman tank and a Panther came down not to armor or firepower, but to something the Germans had not calculated: the weight of the tank and the will of the men inside it. In Part 1, we watched General George Patton do something no senior American commander had done in the entire war. He punished white military police for beating a black soldier. He placed himself personally between his black troops and the institutional machinery that had been grinding them down. He issued a standing order that any complaint of racial abuse would reach his desk within 24 hours. And the 761st Tank Battalion, 2 years trapped in training camps while the war moved without them, finally got their chance to fight. But December 16, 1944, just changed everything. Because on that morning, 30 German divisions detonated out of the Ardennes forest along an 85-mile front, and the hole they tore in Allied lines was so catastrophic, so total, that SHAEF headquarters in Paris went quiet for 6 hours. Senior officers who had been planning the final push into Germany were suddenly looking at maps that showed German armor 60 miles behind what had been the day before a stable front line. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and it would kill more American soldiers than any other engagement of the entire Western Front campaign. Patton had 72 hours to turn 250,000 men 90 degrees north and drive them through frozen roads toward a town called Bastogne. Military historians still call it the most remarkable staff achievement of the war. He did it, but nobody told him what the 761st was going to find when they got there. Bastogne held. The 101st Airborne, surrounded and outnumbered, refused to surrender. But the German perimeter around the Bulge was still intact. And in the frozen forests of Belgium, at a crossroads town called Tillet, something was waiting for the 761st that no training exercise had prepared them for. The man who had to get them through it was not a general. He was not even a senior officer. He was Captain David Williams, Company B Commander, 761st Tank Battalion, formerly a high school mathematics teacher from Birmingham, Alabama, who had spent 2 years teaching geometry to students who could not yet imagine the shapes that war would eventually ask them to make. Williams had applied for officer candidate school in 1942. His scores on the entrance examination were in the top 8% of all applicants that year. The examining board reviewed his scores, reviewed his application, and informed him there was no vacancy in his requested branch. He applied again. Same result. He applied a third time, and an officer who had known his father from a church connection intervened quietly, and Williams received his commission. He had been commanding Company B for 14 months. He knew his tanks. He knew his men. He knew with the precision of a man who had taught mathematics for 6 years exactly what his Shermans could do and exactly what they could not. What he did not yet know on the morning of January 4, 1945, was that the terrain around Tillet was about to give his lighter tanks an advantage that no tactical manual had anticipated. and that the German officers on the other side of that tree line had already radioed their headquarters with an assessment of the American armored unit approaching from the south. The assessment described the 761st as, and this is from a captured German intelligence summary translated by Army G2 in February 1945, a first-rate armored battalion operating with tactical flexibility and aggressive intent. They had not noted the race of the crews. They had noted the performance. But before January 4th, before Tillet, before any of that, Williams had to fight a battle that happened entirely inside American lines. And this battle had a different kind of enemy. His name was Colonel Raymond Hardcastle, senior logistics officer attached to 12th Corps, and he was the man responsible for ensuring that the 761st received their fuel, ammunition, and maintenance support during the Ardennes counteroffensive. On January 2, 1945, Williams received a routing order that placed his battalion's resupply chain through a depot that was by any rational reading of the map 40 miles in the wrong direction. He went to Hardcastle's headquarters. The meeting lasted 11 minutes. Williams described it afterward in a letter to Colonel Bates that survived in the battalion's unofficial records. Williams said, "Sir, this routing adds 8 hours to our resupply cycle. In this terrain, in this weather, 8 hours is the difference between arriving at an objective with ammunition and arriving without it." Hardcastle looked up from his desk and said, "Your battalion will use the designated route. The route was designated for operational reasons above your pay grade, Captain." Williams said, "With respect, sir, I am asking for the operational reason, because I cannot find one on this map." Hardcastle said, "You are dismissed, Captain." Williams was not dismissed. He was furious. He walked out of that headquarters and directly to his radio operator, and sent a message up the chain in language careful enough to avoid insubordination and specific enough to be unmistakable. The message reached Major General Manton Eddy, commanding 12th Corps, within 4 hours. Eddy was not a man who tolerated logistics failures during active operations. He reviewed the routing order. He reviewed Williams's objection. He overruled Hardcastle in writing and forwarded a copy to Patton's chief of staff with a note that read, "According to the staff officer who processed it, routing decisions affecting combat readiness are not administrative preferences. The 761st got their direct supply line. Hardcastle got a letter in his file." But here is the thing that Williams understood, the thing that made his action in that headquarters something more than a bureaucratic complaint. He understood that this was not the first time a black unit had been given the wrong route, the delayed resupply, the defective equipment, the assignment designed to make them fail rather than succeed. It had been happening for 2 years. The difference now was that they had a record. They had 183 days of combat documentation that made the case impossible to dismiss. And they had a general who had made himself personally responsible for what happened to them inside his perimeter. Hardcastle's routing order was not the last obstacle. On January 3rd, the day before the assault on Tillet, a request for additional infantry support that Williams submitted through proper channels came back denied. The reason given was that available infantry assets had been committed to other sectors. This was true. It was also true that the infantry assets committed to other sectors included 2 companies that were by any operational assessment less urgently positioned than the approach to Tillet. Williams went to his maps. He went to his NCOs. He spent 4 hours planning an assault with the assets he had. Sergeant Samuel Ransom, who would later describe the temperature change in 3rd Army's rear areas, was in that planning session. He said afterward that Williams spread the map on the hood of a Sherman in -12-degree cold and talked through the approach geometry with the precision of a man who had once explained the Pythagorean theorem to 16-year-olds. "He showed us where the ground pressure would favor us," Ransom said. "He showed us where the German armor would bog. He was not guessing. He had the terrain elevation data, and he had done the calculations." January 4th, 1945. 0600 hours. The temperature was -15 Celsius. The ground around Tillet was frozen to a depth that German intelligence had calculated would equalize the weight difference between American and German armor. They were wrong. The Sherman M4 weighed 33 tons. The Panther weighed 45. On frozen Belgian terrain, with ground pressure becoming a decisive tactical factor, the lighter American tank moved where the German armor did not. This was not in the doctrine. No one had planned for it. It emerged from the physics of that specific ground on that specific morning. Williams saw it happen in the first 20 minutes of the engagement. Company B's lead element 3. Sherman's advancing on the left flank encountered a stretch of terrain where 2 German Panthers had already become partially immobilized, their weight driving their tracks below the frozen crust into the softer ground beneath. The Panthers could still fire, but they could not maneuver. A non-maneuvering Panther is a pillbox. A pillbox has blind angles. Williams was on the radio inside 60 seconds. Left element sweep wide. Come at them from the northeast. They cannot traverse fast enough. Go. 3 Sherman swept wide. They came in from the northeast. The Panthers traversed. Not fast enough. 2 German panzers confirmed destroyed. 1 captured intact, its crew surrendered to avoid being burned alive when the vehicle was immobilized and the Americans flanked them with infantry. The road junction that anchored the German defensive line in that sector fell by 1400 hours. 3 men from the 761st died at Tillet between January 4th and January 7th. 11 were wounded. Those are the numbers the official record carries. What the official record does not adequately carry is the calculation that Williams made on a frozen map the night before, the calculation that turned a disadvantage in firepower and support into a decisive advantage in positioning. The after-action report filed by Major General Horace McBride of the 81st Infantry Division described the resistance the 761st had overcome as determined and skillfully conducted. He wrote that the battalion had performed with distinction under conditions that would have tested any armored unit in the theater. He recommended them for the Distinguished Unit Citation. The recommendation sat in a filing system for 33 years. But that is a story for later. Because in early January 1945, something else was happening. German intelligence, which had been monitoring the 761st's performance since their November deployment, was revising its assessments upward. They were no longer treating the battalion as an unknown quantity to be tested. They were treating it as a known threat to be planned against. And German planning, when it identified a specific unit as a priority threat, did not remain passive. On January 9, 1945, a report reached Patton's G2 section from Signals Intelligence. German Army Group B had issued a specific tactical advisory regarding American armored units operating in the Tillet sector. The advisory recommended that defending units concentrate anti-tank assets against the identified American battalion before they reached the next phase line. The Germans were not targeting the 761st because of who they were. They were targeting them because of what they had done, and what they were about to face in the sector north of Tillet was not a demoralized rearguard fighting a losing battle. It was a concentrated defensive position built specifically to stop them. Anti-tank guns registered on the approach routes. Panzer reserves positioned for counterattack. Infantry dug into positions that the frozen ground had made harder than concrete. Williams received the intelligence assessment on the morning of January 10th. He read it twice. He looked at his map. He looked at the strength returns from the previous week's fighting. Company B was at 73% strength. Company A was at 68%. The maintenance section had worked through 2 consecutive nights to keep the operational tank count above the minimum threshold for an assault. He picked up his radio handset. All company commanders. O Group at 1800. Bring your terrain analysis. He was not finished. He was not close to finished. But what was waiting north of Tillet, and what the Germans had prepared specifically for the 761st, and what happened when an armored battalion that had been told for 2 years it was not good enough, met a defensive line built by an enemy that had finally decided to take it seriously. That is the story of Part 3, and it begins with a message that arrived at Patton's headquarters on January 11, 1945. A message that made his chief of staff stop what he was doing and walk directly to Patton's office without knocking. The Germans had identified something. And if they were right, The next 72 hours would not just decide the fate of the 761st. They would determine whether the Third Army's entire left flank held. In Part 1, Patton punished white MPs for beating a black soldier and placed himself personally between the 761st and the institutional machinery trying to break them. In Part 2, Captain David Williams led his battalion through the frozen terrain at Tillet, destroyed 2 Panthers, captured a third, and took the road junction that anchored the German defensive line in that sector. Then, German Army Group B issued a specific tactical advisory. They had identified the 761st as a priority threat, and they were building something north of Tillet designed specifically to stop them. The message that arrived at Patton's headquarters on January 11, 1945, contained signals intelligence from a German radio intercept. Army Group B had repositioned 12 anti-tank guns along the approach routes north of Tillet. They had moved panzer reserves forward into hull-down positions on the high ground, and they had requested additional infantry to plug the gaps that the 761st had torn in their line 7 days earlier. The Germans were not improvising anymore. They were planning, specifically deliberately, with the professional precision of an army that had been fighting armored warfare since 1939. They were planning for one unit. By January 1945, the 761st had been in continuous combat for 73 days. They had fought across Lorraine through the Siegfried Line approaches and now into the frozen chaos of the Ardennes counteroffensive. In those 73 days, they had been attached to 4 different infantry divisions. Every divisional commander who had worked with them had requested their continued support. Not one had filed a negative assessment. But the German response to Tillet changed the arithmetic. 12 registered anti-tank guns on known approach routes meant that a direct assault would cost the 761st an estimated 40% of their operational tanks before they reached the first phase line. At 68% strength after Tillet, 40% attrition meant combat ineffectiveness. It meant the battalion would cease to exist as a fighting force somewhere on a frozen Belgian hillside. Williams looked at those numbers. His mathematics teacher's brain ran the calculation without sentiment. The direct approach was not a plan. It was a destruction schedule. German General Major Heinrich Eckart, commanding the defensive sector north of Tillet, had served on the Eastern Front for 2 years before his transfer to the Ardennes. He understood armored warfare the way men understand things they have survived repeatedly. When his intelligence officer briefed him on the 761st's performance at Tillet, on the ground pressure calculation that had immobilized his Panthers, while the lighter Shermans flanked them, Eckart did not dismiss it. He adapted. He positioned his anti-tank guns not on the frozen open ground where the Shermans' weight advantage would apply, but on the forested ridgeline where terrain channeled the American approach into 3 narrow corridors. In those corridors, the ground pressure differential was irrelevant. The corridors were killing grounds. Any tank entering them would be engaged from 3 sides simultaneously. His infantry dug positions into ground that was frozen to 18 inches. They had been digging for 4 days. The positions were reinforced with timber and covered with snow. From the air, they were invisible. From the ground approach, they were invisible until the range was under 200 meters. Eckart told his staff on the morning of January 12th that the American armored battalion that had taken Tillet would not take this position. He had built the position specifically to prevent it. He was wrong, but not for the reasons he expected. Inside the 761st's command post on the evening of January 12th, Williams had a map covered in pencil calculations and was having an argument with his executive officer that his radio operator described afterward as the most useful argument he had ever witnessed. The executive officer believed the battalion should request a delay and wait for additional infantry support. The request had already been submitted once and denied. Submitting it again was not irrational. The position north of Tillet was a prepared defensive line with registered anti-tank coverage. Attacking it without infantry was tactically unsound. Williams said, "They know we're coming. Every hour we wait, they improve those positions. Infantry support arrives in 48 hours. In 48 hours, those anti-tank guns are dug 2 feet deeper, and we still don't have a better approach." The executive officer said, "David, If we lose 30% of our tanks on that approach, Williams said, we're not taking that approach. He pointed to the map. To the northeast, beyond the registered anti-tank corridors beyond the ridgeline that Eckhart had fortified there, was a feature that German planning had treated as an obstacle rather than a route. A frozen creek bed running northeast to southwest below the ridgeline. Too narrow for Panthers. Too exposed for infantry movement. Dismissed by German planners as impassable for any military purpose. A Sherman weighed 33 tons. A frozen creek bed in -15-degree Belgian winter could support 33 tons. Williams had done the calculation 3 times. January 13, 1945. 0430 hours. Still dark. Company B moves out. No headlights. Radio silence except for prearranged signals. 3 Shermans in the creek bed moving northeast. The remaining tanks of Company B holding position at the treeline engines, running visible to any German observer on the ridgeline who happened to be looking south. They are the distraction. Williams needs Eckhart looking south. Eckhart is looking south. The 3 Shermans in the creek bed move for 40 minutes in darkness and -15 cold. The frozen surface holds. 1 tank finds a soft spot, lurches, recovers. The crew does not speak. They correct and continue. At 0510, the 3 Shermans reach the northeastern end of the creek bed. They are now behind the ridgeline. They are inside Eckhart's defensive perimeter without having passed through a single registered kill zone. Williams comes up on the radio. 1 word. Now. Company B opens up from the south. Every gun firing. Not an assault. A noise. A distraction. Every German head on that ridgeline turns south toward the muzzle flashes. The 3 Shermans come over the ridge from the northeast. They hit the first anti-tank position from behind. The German crew is facing south. They die before they can traverse. The second anti-tank position is 40 meters to the west. Same result. The third has a crew member who hears something and turns in time to see a Sherman's muzzle 10 meters away. He shouts once. 7 minutes after the 3 Shermans crested the ridgeline, 5 of Eckhart's 12 anti-tank positions were destroyed or abandoned. The crews of the other 7, realizing their flank was completely compromised, began falling back from their positions without orders. A defensive line without its anti-tank coverage is infantry with rifles facing tanks. Eckhart understood this the moment his radio filled with fragmented reports from the ridgeline. He ordered a withdrawal. Organized if possible. Fast regardless. Company B came through the now unregistered corridors at full speed. They caught the German withdrawal in open ground. In armored warfare, infantry in the open against tanks in motion is not a battle. It is an outcome. By 900, the position north of Tillet was in American hands. Eckhart's defensive sector had ceased to exist as an organized fighting force. German casualties in that engagement, 112, killed or wounded, 41 captured. 2 Panthers destroyed. The road junction that Eckhart's position had been designed to protect was now a 761st command post. American casualties, 4 wounded, 0 tanks destroyed. Sergeant Ransom, whose tank had been one of the 3 in the creek bed, said afterward that when they crested that ridge in the dark, and he understood what they had done, he did not feel triumph. He felt something colder and more specific. He felt correct. Like a calculation that had come out exactly as the formula predicted. Williams filed his after-action report that afternoon. It was 7 pages. The tactical analysis section referenced the ground pressure calculations, the terrain assessment, the timing sequence. It read like a mathematics proof. Precise, sequential, and at the end irrefutable. Major General Manton Eddy of 12th Corps read it within 24 hours. He forwarded it to Patton's headquarters with a handwritten note on the cover. The note said, "This battalion is being underutilized." Patton agreed. The 761st was reassigned to the push into Germany itself. Between January and May 1945, attached to the 71st Infantry Division for the final drive, the 761st crossed the Rhine, penetrated the German interior, and was present at the liberation of the Gunskirchen concentration camp in Austria on May 5, 1945. What the men of the battalion found there, the bodies the living who barely were the systematic evidence of what they had been fighting against for 183 days, settled over them in a silence that several veterans described in post-war interviews as the moment when they finally understood the full weight of what they had done. They had not merely fought for their country. They had fought against something specific. And seeing that something in its full form, reduced to its logical conclusion behind wire and watchtowers, made every frozen night in Belgium, every bureaucratic obstacle, every beaten man in every camp resolve into a single coherent meaning. The 761st Tank Battalion completed 183 consecutive days of combat. They fought across 6 countries. They were attached to 7 different American infantry divisions. Every single divisional commander requested their continued support. Their kill ratios, mission completion rates, and operational tempo across the harshest winter of the war produced statistics that demolished the theoretical infrastructure that segregation had been constructed upon. 11 Silver Stars, more than 70 Bronze Stars. Reuben Rivers, who refused evacuation after taking a wound at Gabeling in November 1944 and continued fighting until he was killed. The following day had been recommended for the Medal of Honor by his commanding officer within weeks of his death. The Army reviewed the recommendation, filed it, did not act. Major General Willard Paul of the 26th Infantry Division formally recommended the battalion for the Distinguished Unit Citation in 1945. The Army reviewed the recommendation, filed it, did not act. Patton himself wrote in his diary that the performance of his black units had exceeded his expectations in every measurable respect. He did not elaborate on what his expectations had been. He did not need to. The gap between expectation and performance was the gap between what the segregated army had told him to expect and what the men had actually delivered. The war ended in May 1945. The 761st came home. They came home to an America that had not changed as much as they had. They came home to base commanders who reinstated segregation policies the moment they crossed back onto American soil. They came home to a government that had their Distinguished Unit Citation recommendation in a filing cabinet and was in no hurry to open it. But something had changed that a filing cabinet could not contain. The evidence existed. It was in the after-action reports, the divisional assessments, the German intelligence summaries, and the diary of the commanding general of the Third Army. The evidence was precise, documented, and impossible to dismiss by anyone willing to read it honestly. Executive Order 9981, signed by Harry Truman. In July 1948, formally desegregated the United States Armed Forces. The Gillum Board's review of black combat performance, which reported in 1946, had made the policy case in language the War Department could not ignore. The 761st's 183 days were central to that report. The Distinguished Unit Citation finally came in 1978, 33 years after Willard Paul wrote his recommendation. Reuben Rivers' Medal of Honor came in January 1997, 52 years after he died in a tank in Lorraine. But what happened to Captain David Williams, the mathematics teacher from Birmingham, who solved a German defensive line with a geometry proof conducted in a frozen creek bed in the dark? What happened to Samuel Ransom? What happened to the soldier beaten in Patton's camp in November 1944? The man whose name the Army's recording apparatus refused to make visible. And what does this story mean, not for 1944, not for the Army, but for every institution in every era that mistakes hierarchy for strength and paperwork for truth? That is the story of Part 4, and it begins with a question that the 761st's history forces us to ask directly. If the system was this wrong about this, what else was it wrong about? And who paid the price for that wrongness, while the people who built the system were busy protecting it? The answer is not comfortable, but it is specific. And specific is the only kind of truth that actually changes anything. 4 parts, 4 hours of war. Let us bring it home. From November 1944 to May 1945, the 761st Tank Battalion fought for 183 consecutive days across France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and Germany. Patton intervened when a black soldier was beaten in his camp, punished the men responsible, and placed himself personally between his troops and the system designed to grind them down. Captain David Williams solved a German defensive line with a geometry proof executed in a frozen creek bed at 0430 in the dark. And the battalion that the United States Army had spent 2 years finding reasons not to deploy became by every metric the enemy applied a first-rate armored force. But here is the question that the official record avoids. What happened to these men when the shooting stopped? What did America give back to the people it had asked to die for it? The answer is the part of the story that the Distinguished Unit Citation filed in 1945 and not awarded until 1978 cannot fully contain. Captain David Williams returned to Birmingham, Alabama in the autumn of 1945. He was 29 years old. He had commanded an armored company in combat for 7 months, solved tactical problems under fire that military academy instructors would later use as case studies, and received a commendation from a 12th Corps commanding general that described his performance as exceptional in every measurable respect. He carried that commendation home in a duffel bag on a troop transport and stepped off a bus in Birmingham into a city that had not changed its signs while he was gone. The sign still said white and colored. He applied for a position teaching mathematics at a white high school. He was told the position was filled. He applied at a second school. Same answer. He eventually secured a position at a black high school in Birmingham, where he taught geometry and algebra for 23 years. His students later described him as demanding, precise, and occasionally terrifying in the way that teachers who have seen real consequences become terrifying. He did not talk about the war in class. When students asked, he redirected them to the problem on the board. He did not receive the Distinguished Unit Citation ceremony in 1978 because he was not invited. The invitation went to the battalion's official veterans organization, and Williams, who had moved to Cincinnati in 1969, was not on their contact list. He learned about the ceremony from a newspaper article 3 weeks after it occurred. Sergeant Samuel Ransom, whose tank had been one of the 3 in the creek bed at Tillet, returned to his family in Louisiana. He worked for 31 years at a paper mill. He attended every 761st Veterans Reunion he could afford to travel to, which in the early years was not every one. At the 1977 reunion, the year before the Distinguished Unit Citation was finally awarded, Ransom stood up during the dinner and read aloud the names of every man from the battalion who had died in combat. He had memorized all of them. He had been memorizing them since 1945 because he did not trust that anyone else was keeping the list. Reuben Rivers, who refused evacuation after being wounded at Gabling and continued fighting until he was killed the following day, was recommended for the Medal of Honor by his commanding officer within weeks of his death. The recommendation was reviewed, set aside, and not acted upon for 52 years. His family received the medal in January 1997 at a White House ceremony. His sister, who had been 11 years old when he died, was 83. She held the medal for a long time before she said anything. The soldier beaten in Patton's camp in November 1944, the one whose beating began this entire chain of events, was never identified in any official record. His name does not appear in the 761st's documentation. It does not appear in the Third Army's disciplinary records, which recorded the MP's punishment, but not the victim's identity. He is the blank space at the center of the story. The Army's recording apparatus refused to make him visible because visibility required accountability, and accountability required change, and change was the one thing the system was organized to prevent. He may have gone home to Georgia or Mississippi or Chicago. He may have lived a long life or a short one. He may have known eventually that the beating he endured in a French camp in November 1944 had triggered a chain of consequences that reached all the way to a creek bed in Belgium, to a White House ceremony in 1997, to the desegregation of the United States Armed Forces. He may never have known any of it. The record does not say. The record was designed not to say. But his his legacy exists, regardless of whether his name does. The evidence the 761st produced in 183 days of combat became the empirical foundation for the policy argument that ended military segregation. The Gillum Board, which reported to the War Department in 1946 on the utilization of black manpower in the military, relied heavily on combat performance data from units like the 761st. The board's conclusions, carefully worded to avoid the full implications of what the data showed, nonetheless made the operational case that segregated forces were less efficient than integrated ones by every measurable standard. That finding did not produce immediate action. The military bureaucracy that had built the segregated system was the same bureaucracy now being asked to evaluate it, and institutions rarely produce honest assessments of their own failures. But the data existed. It was precise, documented, and resistant to dismissal by anyone willing to examine it honestly. Executive Order 9981, signed by Harry Truman on July 26, 1948, formally desegregated the United States Armed Forces. It came 3 years after the war, 2 years after the Gillum Board, and 33 years before the 761st received the Distinguished Unit Citation. The order did not cite the 761st by name. It did not need to. The evidence from which the order's logic derived was inseparable from what those men had done. The tactical principles that Williams applied at Tillet, specifically the use of terrain analysis and weight-to-ground pressure calculations to exploit mechanical advantages in frozen conditions, were incorporated into armored warfare doctrine in the late 1940s. The United States Army's training manuals for armored assault in winter terrain, revised in 1949 and again in 1953, before the Korean conflict, contained sections on ground pressure analysis that traced directly to after-action reports from the Ardennes campaign. Williams's 7-page report was among the source documents cited in the 1949 revision. He was not notified that his report had been cited. He was teaching algebra in Birmingham when the manual was published. During the Korean War, American armored units operating in the winter terrain of the Central Peninsula applied ground pressure analysis as a standard element of route planning. The technique saved an estimated 40 to 60 tanks from becoming immobilized in conditions similar to those at Tillet. The doctrine that Williams had derived empirically in the dark under fire with a pencil and a terrain map on the hood of a Sherman had become standard procedure within a decade of the engagement that produced it. The deeper lesson is not about tanks or terrain or ground pressure calculations. It is about what the segregated army cost itself by spending 2 years refusing to deploy units that were ready to fight. Every month, the 761st sat in a training camp in 1942, and 1943 was a month of combat experience they did not accumulate. Every black officer candidate whose application was rejected by a board looking for reasons to deny rather than reasons to accept was a potential leader the Army never had. Every MP assault on a black soldier in a rear echelon camp was a corrosion of the unit cohesion that combat effectiveness requires. The system was not merely unjust. It was operationally self-defeating in ways that showed up in body counts and missed objectives and battles that lasted longer than they should have. The historians who have studied the 761st's record most carefully have arrived at a calculation that is inherently imprecise, but directionally unmistakable. If units of equivalent quality to the 761st had been deployed in 1942 and 1943, rather than held in training camps, if the armored warfare experience they accumulated in 183 days had instead accumulated across 3 years of campaigning, the operational impact on Allied performance in North Africa and Sicily and Normandy would have been measurable. Battles that cost thousands of lives might have been shorter. Objectives that took weeks might have taken days. The price of the segregated army was not only paid by the men it excluded, it was paid in the extended duration of the war itself, in the additional casualties that a more efficient force would not have suffered in the geography of graves across 3 continents. That is not a comfortable calculation. But specific is the only kind of truth that actually changes anything. Now, the detail that most accounts of this story omit. In 2003, the National Archives declassified a series of Third Army operational records from the winter of 1944 to 1945 that had been held under a restricted access designation for nearly 60 years. Among those records was a document that Patton's chief of staff had filed in December 1944 at the height of the Ardennes crisis, when Patton was simultaneously managing the Battle of the Bulge response and the ongoing disciplinary issues in his rear echelon areas. The document was a personal memorandum from Patton to his adjutant general. It contained a directive regarding the 761st Tank Battalion that had never been publicly known. Patton had written in December 1944 a formal recommendation that the 761st be expanded from a single battalion into a full regiment. He had argued that the combat performance of the battalion justified the creation of a 761st Tank Regiment, with 3 battalions under a black regimental commander integrated into 3rd Army's permanent order of battle. The recommendation was rejected by Schaeff in January 1945. The rejection letter cited logistical constraints and the impracticality of restructuring armored organization during active operations. But the recommendation existed. Patton had made it. In December 1944, at the moment when the weight of the war was heaviest, when every decision carried consequences measured in thousands of lives, he had looked at the evidence and concluded that the correct response was not to continue using the 761st as a temporary attached unit to be borrowed and returned. The correct response was to make them permanent, to build something larger around what they had demonstrated. The Army said no. The recommendation sat in a box marked restricted for nearly 60 years. Williams never knew it existed. Ransom never knew. The veterans who gathered at reunions to read the names of their dead never knew that the general whose army they had served had wanted to give them something the system refused to allow. The document was found by an archivist named Patricia Coleman, who was processing 3rd Army records in 2003 as part of a declassification review. She flagged it for a military historian who was writing about Patton's command style. The historian included a footnote about it in a 2006 academic paper. The footnote has been cited 31 times, 31 citations in academic papers. That is the current measure of public awareness of the fact that Patton tried to build a regiment and was refused. From a mathematics teacher with a pencil and a terrain map to the liberation of a concentration camp in Austria 183 days later. From a beaten soldier whose name the Army refused to record to an executive order that changed the legal structure of the American military. From a recommendation filed and rejected in December 1944 to a footnote cited 31 times in academic literature 6 decades later. The 761st Tank Battalion proved in blood and cold and frozen Belgian terrain that the system designed to protect white soldiers from the supposed deficiencies of black soldiers was the greatest deficiency in the entire Army. They proved it with kill ratios and mission completion rates and after-action reports written with mathematical precision by a man who went home to teach algebra to teenagers and never received an invitation to his own unit's award ceremony. The lesson is not that one general can fix a broken system. Patton could not fix the system. He could only refuse to operate it as it was designed inside his own perimeter. The lesson is that a broken system always costs more than the people who built it are willing to admit, and that the cost is almost never paid by the people who built it. It is paid by the man bleeding in the mud, by the family that waits 33 years for a citation, by the sister who is 83 years old when she finally holds her brother's medal. They were good enough. They had always been good enough. The only question was whether the institution was honest enough to admit what the evidence showed. Some institutions answer that question in time. Some answer it too late. And the ones that never answer it at all leave behind a record precise and permanent and devastating of everything they chose not to see.